Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this morning's webinar. This is our public comment webinar for the development of the Canada Grassland Project Protocol version 1.0. Hopefully that's the show you're interested in watching today. Bit of housekeeping before we launch into it. We're going to have hopefully several dozen attendees, and so we're going to keep everybody on mute. But if you do have a question, you can type it into the question box, and we'll monitor that as we go along. And we'll pause periodically to check for questions and answer them. So feel free to type in questions at any time. This webinar, what we do during the public comment period, is not meant to be the place for people to submit their public comments. This is meant to ensure that everybody has a full understanding of the protocol as you consider submitting your written comments. So we're happy to answer any clarifying questions and take any feedback, but if you do have comments that you'd like to submit related to the protocol, we do ask for those to be in writing. So what we're going to go through today, we've got about 90 minutes scheduled, I believe. There's quite a bit of ground to cover. We'll give a little bit of background on the organization and the process. I know we've got some new stakeholders on the line today that maybe haven't participated much in the Climate Action Reserve's program. I'll go through the details of the Canada Grassland Project Protocol and what's in it, how it works. We'll hopefully have some time for folks to type in questions and we can go through some answers, and then we'll cover next steps. If you do need assistance during the webinar, Betty, one of our policy managers, is available. So her email address is here, bzavaris@climateactionreserve.org. We're also recording the webinar, and we hope to post this recording on our website. If you have not yet actually downloaded and read the draft protocol, it's attached in the handout section of this webinar, so you'll be able to take it from the handout section. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Climate Action Reserve, we're a nonprofit organization based in Los Angeles. We were founded in 2001 by the state of California, although we are a private independent nonprofit. Our main operation is as a carbon offset project registry. So we develop carbon offset project protocols for different project activities, and we issue credits to projects that are following our protocols and go through verification. We operate a voluntary offset registry, so credits that are being used by corporations and individuals to offset their emissions. And we also operate a California compliance offset project registry, whereby we issue credits under California's compliance offset protocols, and those are then used in the California cap and trade system. We've got more than 550 projects now that have come through the program and issued more than 136 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Credits that we issue are called Climate Reserve Tons, or CRTs, also known as carrots. So if I accidentally just say carrots, that's what I'm talking about. You can see right now this map just covers the US and Mexico, and I've entirely cut Canada off of the map. And that's because we don't currently have any protocols for which we can issue credits to projects in Canada. So that's one reason that we're so excited to be in the process that we're in right now with the Canada Grassland Protocol, because this will be the first of our voluntary protocols for Canada, and we're gonna need a bigger map. So I look forward to all of the grassland projects that you folks will be submitting. To get a sense of where the existing US grassland projects are, we've got a few here in southeastern Colorado, northern Montana, and eastern Oregon. There's currently 10 grassland projects. We've issued over 62,000 credits to those projects in the last couple of years, and that covers more than 39,000 acres. So a bit of background on the Grassland Protocol in specific. So the first US Grassland Protocol that the Reserve developed was adopted in mid-2015. We then were working under a USDA Conservation Innovation Grant to find and develop some pilot projects. We had several partners on that grant that helped us identify the pilot projects in southeastern Colorado. And through that process, we also updated the protocol to version 2.0, which was adopted in 2017. And during that year, we issued our first carrots for grassland projects. At the same time, we were engaged under a contract with the governments of Ontario and Quebec to begin adapting 13 compliance offset protocols for use by projects across Canada to support their provincial cap and trade programs. That included avoided grassland conversion. So that's when we began adapting the US grassland protocol for use in Canada. And quite a bit of work was done under that contract until mid-2018. The elections in Ontario signaled the end of the cap and trade program and the end of that protocol development contract. So that work just kind of stopped there. The Grassland Protocol didn't get finished. And in late 2018, the Canadian Forage and Grassland Association and Varesco Solutions came together and were able to get funds to help work with us and other experts in Canada to finish the adaptation of the Canadian Grassland Protocol. So that's the effort that we're hopefully concluding in the next couple of months. So in 2019, we've been working on protocol drafting, meeting with the technical working group. We are currently in the public comment period, and adoption is expected in October. So who are we? I'm Max Dubison, Policy Director here at the Climate Action Reserve. The policy team is our technical team, so we're the ones who do the protocol development and protocol updates and maintenance. Two important team members here at the Reserve that are helping me, Betty Zeveries and Heather Raven. And we're also working with Varesco Solutions very closely. They're helping quite a bit on protocol edits and managing the technical working group process. So this has been a very unique protocol development process. For those of you familiar with the Climate Action Reserve and the way we normally do things, this one's a bit different because of the way it started under contract and then came together as this sort of collaboration to finish. So it's been going really well and we're really pleased. We've also got a very strong technical working group. We've got all of the organizations listed here. I won't read them out, but suffice to say, I think we've got excellent breadth of coverage in terms of different stakeholder groups, and we've gotten lots of excellent feedback from this group. The remaining timeline in this process, there's not much here. I keep making this table smaller and smaller as we get close to the end. Public comment period runs through September 13th, so you've got a couple weeks left. Today we're having the webinar for that public comment period. We'll begin revising the protocol based on the feedback that we receive. Our hope at this point is that the protocol is largely baked and that the public comments don't throw up any significant roadblocks or major problems that we didn't foresee. We'll go through our internal final reviews and then we'll provide the final draft protocol to our board and give them a couple of weeks to review and consider it. The board meeting will be October 16th. The protocol adoption portion of that meeting is public, so if any of you would like to listen in and provide comments in support or against or otherwise this protocol, you are welcome to do that. You can find information about our board meetings on the Climate Action Reserve website, climateactionreserve.org. So with that, I'm gonna jump right into the protocol itself. The beginning of any of our protocols, we've got a section 1 introduction and section 2 defining the greenhouse gas reduction project. So with a grassland project, what we're talking about here is avoided conversion of grassland to crop cultivation. So it's the prevention of emissions of greenhouse gases by conserving those grasslands. We conserve the grassland through the use of a qualifying land conservation agreement. What makes it qualifying is essentially that it prevents the conversion of the project area to cropland. The project area itself needs to be grassland, shrubland, rangeland, or pastureland. It needs to be dominated by grass species. You can have woody areas. You can have limited areas of intact wetlands on mineral soils. So we've got the classification 1 through 3 under the Stewart-Cantrud classification system. These are essentially small and often seasonal wetland areas that are not on organic soils and would be converted if you were to convert the project area into crop cultivation. The land itself must also be suitable for conversion to crop cultivation. I'll go into detail on that later. And the project area must have been in continuous grassland cover for at least 10 years prior to the project start date. Because we are crediting you for protecting carbon that's already in the project area, you need to have this 10-year history in order for the emission factors to be valid. Activities that are permitted during the project: you can have livestock grazing, you could have moderate levels of seeding, fertilizer application, haying, forage harvesting, irrigation, recreational or economic activities. Obviously, there's going to be manure if you've got livestock grazing. You just can't manage that manure in a liquid form. I don't think we'd ever see that, but it does change the emissions profile quite a bit. And we'll get into the quantification section later. Some of these activities are going to represent project emissions that you would have to account for as a debit. Let's get into ownership. So when you're thinking about what is a project and what is the project area, an individual project is going to have a single grassland owner who's able to speak for and sign for the entire project area. So if it's a situation where there's multiple owners, there's going to need to be some agreement between those landowners to identify the one point of contact who is the quote unquote grassland owner for the purposes of the project. There's also going to be one easement holder for that project. There could be multiple easements in the project that covers the entire project area, but they're all going to be the same easement holder. Also, the project area is more than likely not going to match the full boundaries of the easement. So imagine you've got a parcel that is a rectangle and your easement covers that whole rectangle. Your project area might be a smaller sort of irregular polygon within that area because you're going to exclude any buildings, you're going to exclude roads, you're going to exclude, ponds or forested sections, that kind of thing. So as you define which is the land area that would be converted if the project area were converted to crop cultivation. Each project is going to have a variety of different entities involved. So as I said, there's going to be the grassland owner. There's always going to be the easement holder. There's going to be a project developer, so who is actually doing the work of submitting forms and dealing with the registry software and answering questions and hiring verifiers. If it's a cooperative, and I'll talk about cooperatives in a second, there's going to be the project developer is what we call the cooperative developer, and that's where they're managing multiple projects. Now, these entities could be the same person. So the easement holder might be the project developer. We've seen that several times in the US. Or the landowner could be the project developer. We've also seen that. Or it could be a third party. The key there is down here, the greenhouse gas reduction rights. So under the Grassland Protocol, we allow for the greenhouse gas rights to be separated from ownership of the land. So whoever holds the rights to the greenhouse gas emission reductions is what we call the project owner. So that's an important term throughout the protocol. The project owner is whoever owns those rights. They have to have an account in our registry, and that's the entity who's going to get the credits at the end. Even if they've hired somebody else to kind of do the work and fill out the forms, they're still the ones who are going to receive the credits. Because we believe that the easement itself presents perhaps a gray area in terms of ownership of these greenhouse gas reduction rights, we require that both the grassland owner and the easement holder are involved in some greenhouse gas reduction rights agreement. And it can take different forms. We don't specify exactly how that agreement has to look, but they both need to be a party to it. With cooperatives, the idea is joint monitoring, reporting, and verification of multiple projects. So each project's data remains independent of the others, and the carrots are issued to the individual projects, but they're managed together. So you've got one entity, that cooperative developer, who's hiring one verification body, and that verification body is going to write one single report, and hopefully that cooperative developer is organized in the way that they manage the projects, such that they can use the same sort of monitoring report templates and things like that, and the same approaches to documenting everything they need to for the protocol, so that it can become a more efficient process and hopefully reduce costs. Cooperatives are very flexible. There's no kind of timeline around a cooperative. Projects can join or leave at any time. It's really just an administrative vehicle. I think we've covered most of this on the last slide. the idea here is essentially reducing costs, but still maintaining that traceability of credits to the individual projects. So at the end of the day, the credits are still serialized to the project. The credits aren't issued to the cooperative. And it's still easy for the buyer of the credits to go into the registry and find everything they need to know about the individual project in which they were invested. I'm going to flip open the question box real quick, see if anything has come in. The only question here, Robert wants to know if I'm wearing a bow tie this morning. No, Robert, I am not wearing any sort of tie today. A bit more casual for the webinar, but thanks for asking. Okay, eligibility and additionality screens. So this is a really important part of the protocol. We've tried to standardize this as much as possible. Those of you familiar with the US protocol will see similarities, but you'll also see some places where we maybe weren't able to standardize and streamline quite as much due to data availability. So with any project, we need to define the project start date. Events that could mark the project start date, it could be the submittal of the project to the reserve. So when you open an account and you fill out the form and click submit, that could be your project start date. It could be the date you record the land conservation agreement on the project area. So that's the date that you actually protect the project area. Typically, you might use that as your start date if the easement gets recorded before you actually submit the project to us. It could also be the transfer or sale of the property for the purpose of the carbon project. So if a land trust goes and buys a property and wants to do a carbon project on it, if they could use that as the project start date, the date that they purchased it. In any case, that land conservation agreement does need to be recorded before the first verification can be completed. Oh, we've got a question that's come in. Oh, we could use a bit more clarity around ownership. So the definition between the property owner and the easement owner. So when you record a land conservation agreement, you are transferring the development rights, or essentially the easement transfers those rights to another party. So the landowner gets paid, and the land trust, perhaps, that is the holder of that easement now holds those rights. They had to pay for those rights, but they're able to enforce that easement and prevent the landowner from converting the property. So there's always going to be at least these two parties involved in the project, because one person's going to own the land and somebody else is going to own that easement. Good question. An important point to consider with start date is that we say here no more than 12 months prior to project submission. What that means is if you are using the sale of the property or the recordation of the easement as your project start date, then you need to get that project submitted to us within a year of that project start date. The one exception to this is because this is a new protocol and we've been working on it for a couple of years, we will have a look back period for projects that got underway while we were working on this. So we are proposing a 2-year look back period that begins the date the protocol is adopted, and the window of opportunity to take advantage of it goes for 1 year. So basically start dates back to October 2017 are allowable as long as those projects are submitted before October 2020. We've got another question related to easement holder versus landowner. Could the easement holder change their mandate at any point and develop the land contrary to landowners' wishes? So a conservation easement is going to have very specific terms in it. There's pretty tight definitions about conservation easements, what they are and how they're written. And the short answer is generally no. So the easement holder is preventing the development of that land and not necessarily taking the right to develop it themselves. Typically, there's going to be conservation values that are identified and required to be protected by that agreement. So the next steps in the additionality section, the first is the legal requirement test. So this is something that we have in every single one of our protocols. And the question here really is that land legally able to be converted to cropland as of the project start date? So there could be a pre-existing easement or restriction on the property that maybe prevents it from being converted to a housing development, but doesn't prevent it from being converted to cropland. So we do see that sometimes. And in that case, that's okay. It's not, you wouldn't fail the legal requirement test. You would need to either amend that easement or record an additional easement that does prevent conversion to cropland in order for it to qualify for the project. On the other hand, if you had a full conservation easement on a property that already prevents its conversion, then you would not be able to do a carbon project on that property. It is already protected. It's not able to be converted to cropland. The next test is the performance standard test. So this is a two-part test. The first is the financial additionality screen. It's a proxy for the financial pressure to convert the project area to annual cropland. So in the US protocol, some of you might know that this has a default option based on rental rate values published by the US government. In Canada, we've only got the site-specific real estate appraisal option, unfortunately. So there's guidance around how that works. Part two is the land suitability screen. So I'm gonna go into detail on both of these. So in the financial additionality test, we're focused on what we call the cropland premium. This is the cropland value minus the grassland value. So the difference between the value of the land as cropland and the value of that land as grassland divided by the value of the land as grassland. And that gives you a percentage. So for example, a 100% cropland premium essentially means that the land is worth twice as much as cropland as it is as grassland. Now, the way this works, these thresholds are set at 40% and then another threshold at 100%. So a cropland premium below 40% is ineligible as a project. It's considered that there's not enough financial pressure to consider the baseline valid that the project area would be converted. 100%, as I said, double the value is eligible with no discount. We're essentially assuming that there's no uncertainty around whether or not that project area would be converted for cropland. And then in between those two, between that 40% and 100%, there's this baseline discount on a sliding scale to represent the uncertainty of the baseline conversion scenario. So at 100% cropland premium, the discount is 0, and down to 40% cropland premium, the discount is 50% of your baseline credits, and in between essentially would be in between. So all projects obtain a certified real estate appraisal to identify this cropland premium. Appraisals reviewed by the expert panel for the eco-gift program participation do meet the performance standard test. We've got a couple of questions that have come in on this slide. How difficult or time intensive is it to obtain a certified real estate appraisal to identify the financial pressure to convert? Well, we haven't done it yet. The one kind of data point we have on this was a US project developed under another registry. And my understanding from feedback on that project is that it was expensive and time intensive. So I think it remains to be seen a little bit exactly how this plays out. And we're interested in getting feedback from projects as they apply it. Next question here around suitability. And the majority of rangelands or grasslands existing in Canada are not arable or suitable for farming, and do they not qualify? That is a great lead into the next section of the presentation, so I'm going to table that. I'm not going to go through all the requirements of the certified real estate appraisal. These are all spelled out in the protocol, but suffice to say we've got some standards here that we need to be followed. Now on the suitability threshold, the idea here is you do have to demonstrate that the project area is suitable for crop cultivation. So we would be seeking to exclude areas of land that would not be suitable for crop cultivation because for those areas, the baseline would not be valid. So we're relying on existing rating systems, the LSRS, the Land Suitability Rating System, or the CLI, the Canada's Land Inventory. If there are not existing classification data available for your project area, or if you believe that those data are out of date or inaccurate for your project area, you could engage with an independent expert to do an assessment of your project area. For those not familiar with the rating system, here's the descriptions of the LSRS. So classes 1 through 4 are identified as suitable for cultivation. As you go up in class, there's sort of more limitations of which crops you could do, and you may need to have special practices or sort of interventions on the land to prepare them for cultivation. 5 and 6 tend to have more severe limitations for crop cultivation and would generally require additional effort to make them suitable. 7, those soils have no capacity for arable agriculture, and 8 are organic soils, which are not included. So what we've done is set a threshold for how much of your project area has to be class 1 through 4, because we recognize that there are existing croplands on class 5 and class 6 soils, and there's also increased conversion of class 5 and class 6 because a lot of the class 1 through 4 soils are already in crop cultivation. So in new conversion scenarios, you're even more likely to see class 5 and 6 soils. So what we've done is we've looked by ecoregion and assessed existing cropland over a several year period against the CLI, because there was so much good coverage for the CLI data, and determined within that ecoregion what percent of cropland is on class 1 through 4 soils and what percent is on class 5 and 6 soils. So here's the map for you. All of the ecoregions that are in this sort of lightest green color and don't have a number, the threshold is set at 100%. So the entire project area would be class 1 through 4 soils. These other ecoregions where there was more cropland available to analyze, the thresholds are going to be something lower than 100% based on the way farmland is classified already. This is in a table in the protocol. So you would identify your ecoregion, look it up in the table, and there is your threshold. This is a percent area threshold. So for example, here in this region, 90% means that at least 90% of your project area has to be class 1 through 4, and the remaining 10% can be class 5 or 6. Again, no class 7 or 8. I'm going to pause here for a second. There's a question about why are we limiting the protocol to just land conservation agreements? Private landowners without an easement could have the same benefits. I think we're going to cover that pretty thoroughly when I get to the permanent section. So I'm going to table that question. Oh, another one has just come in. So the question here about eco zones versus reporting zones. So we are using two different things. So it's eco regions rather than eco zones. And the reporting zone is slightly broader. The eco regions there's sort of more of them within the reporting zones. And so the eco region is only used here for the suitability threshold. For everything else, for the quantification, you're using reporting zones. Another question that's come in, does the CLI have class 1 through 8 attributes as well? Yes, the CLI classification works in the same way. The identification of the classes when you're actually applying that approach works a little bit differently, but for our purposes, we're treating them as equivalent. So I'm going to move along. There's occasionally questions about credit stacking. Can you be doing other creditable activities on the project area at the same time? The answer is it depends. So if that other activity requires a legally binding agreement that would throw into question the legal requirement test, then we have to look at whether the timing of that agreement. So if that agreement comes before the carbon project, then you may fail the legal requirement test because the project area may already be protected. If it comes after the start date of the carbon project, then we generally do not have a problem with that as long as they're not crediting for the same emission reductions. Now, what we do see is sometimes those programs, you wouldn't be able to get into them after because you've already got a conservation easement on the land, and so you wouldn't be eligible for that program. You can do it what we call concurrently. So if you've got one land conservation agreement that gets you in as a carbon project and perhaps also gets you into some other program for crediting habitat protection or something like that, that may be allowable. There also may be what we call activity-based credits. So you could be getting payments for doing additional conservation activities, planting windbreaks or buffering around water courses, that kind of thing. That's generally not going to be a problem with the carbon project. So basically, we need you to disclose any potential or ongoing participation in other programs so that we can confirm that there's no problem with the legal additionality of the project and no double counting of any greenhouse gas reductions. So the crediting period is the period of time over which, the entire period of time over which the project can receive credits. So the maximum crediting period for these projects is 30 years from the project start date. The emission factors are in 10-year increments. So you would use the same baseline factor for the first 10 years, and then you would switch to another one for the next 10 years. You can voluntarily end the crediting period at any time. This is separate from the permanence period, which I'll talk about later. But if you are only interested in verifying receiving credits for the first 10 or 20 years, that's generally fine. In terms of cooperatives, the cooperative doesn't have its own crediting period. Each project is going to have its own crediting period. So your cooperative could actually live on for decades. Let's get into permanence. So a CRT, let's remember, is an offset credit. So when it gets used, which means it gets retired in our system by somebody who purchased it, this allows the emission of a ton of CO2 equivalent somewhere else in the planet. So for example, if somebody wants to offset their air travel, there's going to be a direct CO2 emission there, and then they're going to retire your grassland credits to offset it. The emission that was allowed to occur, for example, the CO2 from the airplane, is effectively in the atmosphere forever. It takes a very long time for that CO2 to go away. The international community is defined forever as being 100 years in order to make offsets more practical. So in order for offsets to represent a permanent reduction, they have to represent 100 years of pulling that CO2 out of the atmosphere. Now, some emission reductions are reversible, where we have to worry about that permanence, and some are not reversible, where we don't have to worry about permanence. So projects that capture, destroy, or avoid emissions such as, say, landfill gas destruction, that is not reversible. When you destroy that methane, it's gone forever. So there's no need for long-term storage of CO2 that's been captured or avoided. An example within this grassland protocol would be the avoided fertilizer use from cultivation. So part of the baseline emission factors calculates the nitrous oxide emissions that would have occurred from fertilizer use. And when you avoid that fertilizer use, you permanently avoid those emissions. Now, reversible emission reductions are things like land use projects, grassland and forestry, where you're storing that carbon in the land and the biomass, and it could be released at some time before the 100 years is up. So in those cases, we need special measures in place to ensure the permanence and make sure that those emission reductions are comparable to non-reversible emission reductions. Now I'm going to make it more complicated. So there's also a time value over that 100-year period. So this graph you're seeing here is 100 years along the x-axis, and then the radiative forcing along the y-axis. So we get to 1, that is the radiative forcing of carbon dioxide over 100 years. Based on this 100-year scale, this is almost a straight line. There's approximately 1% of that total radiative forcing benefit occurs each year that the carbon is stored. So recognizing this time value allows us to explore alternative crediting approaches so that projects maybe don't have to make a full 100-year commitment. And it also means that the reversals themselves become less significant in the future. So if you reverse, you get a ton in year 1, you reverse it in year 50, you've actually achieved 50% of the 100-year carbon benefit of that ton. So it's not a 100% reversal. So let's talk about how we put this into practice in the protocol. Essentially, this protocol offers you 2 paths. You can choose your own adventure for crediting and permanence. The first, ton-ton accounting. This is our traditional way of accounting. You make a 100-year legal commitment to monitoring and reporting and keeping that carbon in the project area and paying back any reversals. So if you choose this approach, this is the way the US Grassland Protocol works. You put in a permanent conservation easement and you sign a project implementation agreement with the reserve. You get full value of your credits at verification. So for a ton avoided in year 1, you receive a ton. There's higher cost, there's higher reversal risk, but there's also higher reward. You get your tons right away. We'll get into the buffer pool later, but there's basically higher risks here and more buffer pool contribution. Now with ton year accounting, we recognize this time value and parse it out 1% per year that the carbon is protected. We do ask for a 20-year minimum commitment. So we want the baseline to be valid, that you're not just, putting off crop cultivation for a year or 2 in order to get some credits, but you're going to do it anyway. This is about really conserving the land for a significant amount of time. But at the end of that 20 years, if you're following the ton year accounting, you don't have to make any additional commitment. The project owner could make an additional commitment. They could extend that 20 years to another 20 years. They could be extending that 20 years every year. That's the way we've been seeing it in our Mexico forest protocol, where they make a 20-year commitment and every year they extend that commitment for another 20 years. So it can get a bit complicated, but it's also very flexible. So you can choose what works for you. Now, the key here is that this changes your crediting profile. So if you make a 20-year commitment upfront instead of a 100-year commitment, you're going to get 20% of that year's credits instead of 100% of that year's credits. And then the next year you'll get 19% of that year's credits. And then the next year you'll get 18%. So you see, it's based on the amount of time that you've legally committed yourself to protecting that carbon. At the end of that period, if you don't re-up and you decide to stay in the program, each year that you can show that the project area remains protected, you'll get another 1% of the previously verified reporting periods. So it builds in this incentive to stay in the program long-term, because you'll actually continue to receive credits into the future, even if beyond the crediting period. This has some lower costs. You don't have to do the full permanent easement. You don't have to commit yourself to 100 years, but you get fewer credits and crediting is delayed. In terms of compensating for reversals, if they do occur, we separate them into 2 categories: avoidable reversals, those due to intent, such as plowing up the project area or simply canceling the project and leaving the program, or negligence. So if somebody else disturbed the project area and the project owner didn't do anything to stop them. In these cases, the project owner pays back any of the carrots related to the reversible emission reductions. So remember, not all of the baseline emissions are reversible. And then this payback also gets discounted over time. So if the reversal happens far into the future in the project, the payback will be smaller than if it happened right away. Unavoidable reversals would be acts of nature. There's a buffer pool, so every time the project goes through verification, we assess the risk of unavoidable reversals, and you pay a percentage of your credits into this shared risk buffer pool that's shared with all the other grassland projects. That risk ranges from 2% to about 16.8%, depending on the characteristics of the projects. We don't expect to see a lot of unavoidable reversal risk with grassland projects. You know, for example, if you saw a fire come through the grassland area, that still is not expected to affect the below ground soil carbon pools, so it's not a reversal. So I've got another question about suitability here. Why doesn't the land include lands that are not suitable for crop conversion? If it were to include non-arable lands under permanent grass, this could expand the project area exponentially. It would provide the landowner with added incentive not to convert the unsuitable lands to cropping systems. The entire quantification of the emission reductions for this is based on the conversion of the grassland to annual crops. And if we can't feel assured of the validity of the counterfactual baseline scenario that the project area would in fact be converted to annual crops, then there is no validity to the quantification of emission reductions. We had one more question about how the baseline changes after 10 years. It's simply the number itself. So when you look at the table in the protocol that gives you the emission factors, it shows that carbon change factor and how it changes for each decade of the project. Let's talk a bit about legal instruments. We've covered the Qualified Land Conservation Agreement. This is what is protecting the project area. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Rights Contract, again, this needs to involve the landowner and the easement holder. It may also involve a third party, but whatever form that this agreement takes, this is what establishes the identity of the project owner. This could be language that is worked into the conservation easement. This could be a separate contract. We've seen both already in the program. Either is sufficient. The project implementation agreement is the contract between that project owner and us, the Climate Action Reserve. This is to ensure the ongoing monitoring and reporting and allow us to enforce on reversals. To be a qualified land conservation agreement, essentially it needs to prevent the conversion of the project area from grassland. So it needs to maintain that, that grassland land cover in an enforceable way. The minimum term here is 20 years if you're going to use the ton-year accounting. We do have some recommended provisions in the protocol, but again, we're flexible. We understand most land trusts and conservation organizations already have ways that they like to structure their easements. So we don't want to completely change the way the legal part of this has to happen. We do have some, I've covered most of this, but I will note we do have some template language for a greenhouse gas reduction rights contract. So we'll have to adapt this for Canada, but you can see the version that's available in the US right now. And essentially we have the draft or the template project implementation agreement you can find on our website. Within that template, there is a template appendix or exhibit for a greenhouse gas reduction rights contract. Yours doesn't have to look just like that, but if you're starting from scratch and you're interested in some legal language that would convey those greenhouse gas reduction rights, we do have a template. The PIA, this is essentially the final step during verification. So it's not until we've actually reviewed your verification report, everything is good, we're ready to approve the project for issuance. That's the point at which you legally commit yourself to the Climate Action Reserve and to monitoring and maintaining the credits that we're going to issue. If you're doing ton-ton accounting, this PIA gets amended and extended every time you go through verification. So it's always 100 years following the most recent credit issuance. So if you go through a full 30-year project, that means, or 30-year crediting period, that means your entire project lifetime would be 130 years. All right, let's go to the fun stuff, quantification. Greenhouse gas assessment boundary. This is in section 4 of our protocols, identifies the different sources, sinks, and reservoirs. That's what SSR stands for greenhouse gases, and whether they're relevant in the baseline, the project scenario, or both, and whether they are within the boundary of quantification for this protocol. So you can see here in the baseline, we're concerned with the below ground soil carbon. We're not crediting for above ground biomass. And in the project scenario specifically, we expect there to be grazing and burning and perhaps irrigation, so these things are accounted for as well. I'm going to go through each of these individually. So when we're calculating our baseline emissions, and for those who don't think in these terms very frequently, your emission reductions equals your baseline emissions minus your project emissions. So what are the emissions we are avoiding? And then what are the emissions that actually happened that we need to subtract out? In the baseline, you've got reversible and non-reversible tons. So the reversible tons are the organic carbon loss. Again, the actual number of tons that will be credited in any given reporting period depends on the length of your permanence commitment. And then the non-reversible tons, we've got N2O and CO2 from fertilizer use in the crop cultivation scenario, and then fossil fuel use in the crop cultivation scenario. Most of these baseline emission equations are default factors that are based on areas. So you stratify the project area and each acre has a different emission factor. So when we're identifying our strata, there's 2 steps, pretty straightforward. The first is the reporting zone. These are areas, fairly broad areas of similar geography and climate. And then the soil texture. So we're looking at the surface texture of the soil. There's a table in the protocol that gives many detailed surface texture categories and explains how those map to these 3 broad categories of coarse, medium, and fine. So then you'd have your project area split up by reporting zone and soil texture. If your project is entirely within one reporting zone, then at most you would have 3 strata, 1 for each soil texture. But it's entirely possible that we'll see projects that straddle 2 reporting zones and may have more strata. The standardized emission factors based on these strata were developed across Canada using Canada's National Inventory Report. There's 2 discounts that are built into the baseline emissions. The first we've already covered. This is the cropland premium and that discount related to the uncertainty of baseline conversion. The second discount here is the uncertainty of modeling future practices. So there's inherent uncertainty around what was done here to take NIR carbon change factors based on the past and send them out into the future. So what we've got here is a fixed uncertainty discount. It's indexed to this year, the year we're adopting the protocol. Starts at 1%, and every 5 years it goes up another 1%. And our thinking is that if in the future we're able to remodel the emission factors, then the discount would reset back to 1%. In the project scenario, so what's actually happening once you've started your project, we expect most projects are going to involve grazing. So you need to subtract out methane from manure and enteric fermentation, as well as nitrous oxide from manure. To do this, you're going to need to know what animal category, the number of animals, the average ambient temperature during the grazing season, and the number of grazing days. There's different ways that you can fulfill those data requirements. So we try to be very flexible about the monitoring approach there. For burning, we essentially need to know what acres, how many acres in which stratum were burned, and we've got default IPCC emission factors to account for the N2O and methane from those fires. You're not debited for the carbon dioxide because we didn't credit you in the baseline for the carbon stored in the above ground biomass. Any fossil fuel use and electricity use, there's default emission factors based on the NIR. For fertilizer application, we've got an approach based on default factors. And then if there are wetland areas within the project, you've got an area-based emission factor to cover the methane emissions from those wetland areas. Another important project emission to consider is what we call leakage. So leakage is the conversion of other grassland areas to cropland outside of the project area. So if there really is pressure to convert your project area into cropland, then depending on the sort of elasticity of the market for agricultural goods and for the crops that would be grown there, that pressure may shift elsewhere to convert other areas. Leakage can be a really tricky thing to figure out, especially when we're talking about a counterfactual scenario. And it depends a lot on the boundaries you draw and how you define the leakage. In the US, we've got a 20% default factor. This is based on several studies of a program called the Conservation Reserve Program, which are 10-year contracts that keep cropland out of production. This is a very conservative estimate based on those studies, and we felt it was applicable as well in Canada, and the work group felt that it was appropriate as well. So that same discount is built into this protocol, 20% taken as a project emission off your baseline emissions. Okay, let's move on to monitoring, section 6 of the protocol. So one really important thing is land use. Is your grassland still grassland? Did you plow it up and plant corn? Generally, we're also looking at soil disturbance, so monitoring for reversals on the project area. Monitoring for grazing, again, we try to be flexible, so it could be the case that you've got a highly advanced rancher or grazier who has got, RFID tags on all the animals and drones going around, or you may have very, very limited information about the details of the grazing activities. In those cases, we've got suggestions for how one could go about estimating the factors that are needed to calculate the grazing emissions. And it's a significant enough source that we need to be measuring it, but it's not so significant that if you are very conservative in your estimation, it's still not going to greatly harm your crediting. Let's see. So we've got a question here, does it make sense to have fossil fuel emissions for the project and not the baseline? I'd assume the baseline had larger emissions. So you would account for fossil fuel emissions in both scenarios. So in the baseline, there's going to be fossil fuel use in crop cultivation activities. And then if you are using fossil fuels in the project scenario, you would account for those as well. Typically what we see is people might have, a truck or ATV or something like that that they're using for monitoring the property and make some estimations about the amount of fuel used each year. In some cases, you might also see electricity usage, perhaps irrigation pumps or fencing, something like that, and you would account for that as well. During the first verification, it's also important to document the land use history. So as I said, the project area has to be continuous grassland cover for at least 10 years. We try to be flexible here. Essentially, your verifier needs to reach reasonable assurance that for any given year in that 10-year period, you've provided some compelling evidence that the project area was a grassland. So we ask for essentially 2 different forms. So you've got kind of corroboration of 2 different forms of evidence. You could have time-stamped aerial photos, you could have satellite imagery, you could have some grazing leases. So if you show that you were leasing that property out for grazing every year for the last 10 years, during the growing season, then that kind of thing can help demonstrate that land use history. This is something that only really occurs in that initial verification to sort of set the baseline. There's also requirements around monitoring ecosystem health. So it's required that projects periodically assess the ecosystem health. The first assessment needs to happen before either the first or second verification. and then at least every 6 years thereafter. So this is a very broad, long-term view of the health of the ecosystem. We've tried to be flexible again here because different folks are going to have different approaches. So one option is the Rangeland Health Assessment Protocol developed by Alberta Environment and Parks. But you could have an alternative assessment. We ask that whatever you plan to do to comply with this requirement, that you bring your approach to the reserve and ask us to approve it. Our hope is that over time, ecosystem health becomes easier and easier to assess via remote sensing. And on this topic, we've got the question of how do you monitor if it's still grassland? So that could be via remote sensing. That could be via the verifiers visiting the site. It could be via geo-referenced photos. So for example, if the land manager or the easement holder goes out there a couple times a year with a smartphone or a drone or something like that and just takes photos or videos in various parts of the property, that might be sufficient to show that it is still grassland. Those options are sort of spelled out within the protocol. The lists for monitoring land use that are included in the protocol are not meant to be exhaustive. So if you have other ideas, we would entertain them. In terms of monitoring livestock, like I said, we need to know total animal grazing days for each type. There's a lot of different ways that you could come up with this, and we're happy to work with people to assess whether or not their approach is going to be reasonable. We need to monitor grazing, not only for the actual direct project emissions, but we also need to have a mechanism in place to prevent against overgrazing. So there's different ways you could come at this as well. There could be terms within your land conservation agreement that would prevent overgrazing. Perhaps there's specific language that limits grazing activities, or perhaps there's language that, for example, requires adherence to a vegetation management plan, and you'd be violating that if you were overgrazing the project area. You could have a prescribed grazing management plan that is adopted by the rancher and is developed to a recognized standard for long-term grazing management. And you could be using the mechanisms for monitoring ecosystem health. So that's the other option. If you've got, when you're fulfilling this requirement, if what you're doing to monitor ecosystem health could be used each year to detect and identify overgrazing, then that could also satisfy this same requirement. In any case, during a reporting period, we need to be comfortable that there's a mechanism in place that would detect any overgrazing activity. Now, this is something that may be kind of a multi-year idea. So again, we're not setting specific stocking rate limits or anything like that in the protocol. We're trying to walk this balance between being flexible with the way people manage the land, but also protecting the carbon that we're crediting. So in the verification activities, you need to use an approved verification body. In the US, our verifiers are accredited by ANSI, the American National Standards Institute, and they take training by the Climate Action Reserve for the Grassland Project protocol. So lead verifiers need to take protocol-specific training. I believe that we're exploring options for alternative verifier accreditation in Canada, so stay tuned for that. In terms of the verification activities themselves, the site visit is optional because you can do so much via remote sensing these days for grasslands. We consider that there's still some risk if you don't go through with a site visit, even one site visit. So there's an added 5% buffer pool contribution for that risk until a site visit occurs. But if you do have a single site visit, it removes that buffer pool contribution. So, we encourage folks to go through the site visit in their first year, and then it's optional for them afterwards. There's also the desk review component of the verification. or if it's a verification without a site visit, the entire thing is a desk review. And in that case, they'll be looking at your maps and your quantification and your documentation to meet all the protocol requirements. The more organized that you can be about documenting how you comply with every aspect of the protocol, the fewer hours your verifier is going to need to spend. So the timelines for this, a reporting period is the period of time, discrete period of time over which you're reporting one batch of emission reductions. So the initial reporting period can be up to 24 months in length, and then subsequent reporting periods may cover no more than 12 months. So we encourage people to get themselves on a calendar year schedule. You don't have to, but I think it makes things a little easier. So if you start your project in July, maybe your first reporting period is going to be, 18 months, and then after that you get on a calendar schedule. Your verification period is the period of time that you are engaging a verifier and submitting for credit issuance. So that first verification period is just one reporting period. So your first reporting period has to be verified alone, and that begins at the project start date. But subsequent verification periods, you can defer verification up to 6 years. So you could verify 6 reporting periods all at once. So in those interim years, you'd be submitting monitoring reports to us, but you wouldn't be going through verification. You also wouldn't be earning any credits or receiving any credits. So you only receive credit issuance following a successful verification. When it comes to a cooperative, you got a single verification period for the entire cooperative. So in that first verification period, you may have different reporting start dates for different projects, but then the period ends on the same date for all of those projects. We suggest that cooperative developers use that initial verification period to coordinate all the projects that are in their cooperative, get them on the same reporting and verification cycle. If there's individual projects that can't meet the protocol requirements, even within the cooperative, they could report 0 carats for that period, and it wouldn't affect the successful verification of the remaining projects in the cooperative. Let's see. Okay, well, great. It looks like a question has just come in. I'm gonna pull up the question box and folks can feel free to type away. The question that came in just now: since this protocol was originally being developed for use in the Western Climate Initiative market with Ontario and Quebec, do you foresee this protocol being used under either the Canadian Federal Offset Program under development or in any of the provinces such as Alberta and Saskatchewan? Have any discussions been had on that topic with any of those levels of government? So the short answer is this is going to be a voluntary protocol for the Climate Action Reserve, and any credits issued are voluntary CRTs. We hope that this protocol could be taken up for use in a compliance program. The original US Grassland protocol was designed specifically with California's program in mind, and we still hold out hope that the California Air Resources Board will consider it for adoption. They're putting together a task force now to consider new project protocols. And it wasn't, this is the form that it has taken now is largely the form that it would have taken under the contract with Ontario and Quebec. So this is essentially, it's not in their legal format, but this is essentially the protocol that we would have submitted to those governments. And we believe that that could easily be used in any compliance program across Canada. In terms of whether any of them will pick it up, that's not really for me to speculate. Each of the provinces that are tackling this are kind of doing it in their own way, and we would hope that those who have grassland areas at least would consider this, and we would hope that the federal government would consider this as well. We have submitted a letter to the Alberta Climate Change Office to see about adapting this as a compliance protocol in Alberta. I believe that's a kind of longer term process, so nothing to say more about that at this time. Thank you for the question. Do we have additional questions? I'll wait a moment. There was one question from earlier that I don't think I fully responded to about using the ecoregions versus reporting zones. The questioner points out that he says ecozones, I believe you mean ecoregions, are sort of smaller and more specific than the reporting zones, and so wouldn't it be more accurate to do the quantification on ecoregions? That may be, but when the emission factors were developed, it was not possible to split them up by ecoregions just based on the way the data were reported in the NIR. So those are done at the reporting zone level, but since with the suitability threshold, we were able to carve it up by ecoregions, we decided to do it that way. Since your suitability threshold is a little bit separate than your stratification for quantification. In the protocol, there are several places where an opinion is needed, not verification. What changes are required to an agrologist is the opinion giver? I'm not sure that I fully understand the question. Could you perhaps give some additional detail? I'm also happy to follow up offline if you'd like to talk further about this question. And on the next slide, I'll provide contact information for all of us. Okay, here's some additional information on that question. An agrologist is a licensed profession in Canada and can give an opinion example of who signs off on the range assessment. Is there anything in particular that would be helpful? Oh wait, so I'm still not sure if I understand the nature of the question itself. I mean, that sounds like the kind of expert that would sign off on a grazing management plan, for example. So in places where the protocol needed to be very specific about who gives an opinion on something, it is. And there may be other places where we say, you know, an appropriate expert. If there's specific language in specific sections that that you would suggest that we tweak, please submit that in your comments. So last question here, is there anything in particular that would be helpful for feedback on the protocol? I would say, you know, what we really hope during public comment is that folks read the protocol based on their own expertise and knowledge. And, you know, if there are certain sections where you have more expertise and knowledge, you know, focus your efforts on those sections and really think through how this would play out in practice and whether we need to adjust the language. You know, I'd say the overall kind of structure and shape of the protocol is pretty much fixed after our work with the technical working group, but the way we approach different things is generally always informed through public comment. So for public comment, as I said, the deadline is Friday, September 13th. We prefer that people use Microsoft Word documents rather than putting their comments directly in the body of an email. We also prefer that you organize your comments by protocol section. This makes it much easier for us to consolidate the comments and respond to them. We will consolidate them into one summary of comments, and we will respond to all of the comments and publish those responses online. You send your comments into us via email, policy@climateactionreserve.org. Feel free to copy any of us directly if you feel like you're not getting through, but that's an email account that's monitored by multiple staff. And then the next step after that is that the board will consider adoption on October 16th. So if you need to reach any of us on the development team, if you have additional follow-up questions that you'd like to ask before you submit your comments, please feel free. We're happy to have them. Otherwise, I'll wait for one more minute in case folks have any other burning questions. and then we will adjourn. We had a question about whether this presentation would be available to rewatch. Yes, we have been recording it, and we hope to post the recording on our website. If you go to the climateactionreserve.org and up at the top in the menu boxes, I think it's maybe under the How It Works menu, you'll be able to go into the protocols and find the Canada Grassland Protocol webpage, and that's where all of this will be housed. With that, I'm going to call the webinar to a close. Thank you all for your attendance. Thank you again to the team helping us develop this protocol. We're again very excited to have our first Canadian protocol so close to the finish line. So we look forward to receiving all of your comments. Thank you again.